Hello and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Ayurveda for our weekly monk chat session. I'm also featuring Monk Cat today. So the monastery cat is also joining us, though he doesn't normally answer questions. So this is your weekly opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism, and we'll do our best to give helpful replies. So feel free to type in questions at any time. So we'll go ahead and start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll start going through the questions and see where it goes from there. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So welcome to the people joining in online. So hello to Sadhu, good name. Hello to Sadhu, Miguel, Bhavani, Chema, Moraya, Yankee, Karuna, Valerie, Rebecca, S, Maria, Bhumika, Hasanta, Mary, and Kim. Welcome to all of you.
Welcome.
And I see a few questions here already. So Sadhu says, how is it possible that an Arhat doesn't make any new karma? Why would an Arhat not only make good karma? So as far as I'm aware, the concept that Arhats don't make karma actually comes from the commentaries. I don't think it actually says that in the suttas anywhere. Does it actually say that in the suttas anywhere that you can remember?
Well, it talks about the cessation of karma in terms of being free. I saw did a sutta on it actually recently, I think, but it's maybe a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point is that Arhats are free from rebirth, so they can't produce the kind of karma that leads to rebirth.
Yeah.
But they're still doing actions. So they're still doing karma in the ordinary sense of performing actions. So I think in the later Abhidhamma commentaries, they made a distinction between functional actions, like actions which purely have immediate, morally neutral results in the present life, versus the kind of karma that arises from ignorance and produces further rebirth. So it gets into rather technical distinctions. And it also comes down to how we're using the word karma. So keeping in mind that the word karma at its most basic meaning just means action, any kind of intentional action. So Arhats do still make intentional actions. So in that sense, they are still making karma. What is different is that Arhats don't have any delusion or ignorance. They don't have the wrong view of self-existence. They don't have any basis for further rebirth. Therefore, they cannot make the karma that leads to rebirth. And they're also incapable of making any kind of intentionally harmful actions. So they cannot make mundane bad karma either. So it's one of these kind of fine points, which mostly seems as far as I can tell, to boil down to terminology. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Bhante. Yeah, I guess another way of approaching this that came to my mind is in the Buddha gives a teaching on 4 nutriments or 4 kinds of intake. And the third one in there is manosanchetana, which is mental intention or mental volition. And it's basically synonymous with karma, but in this sense, it specifically means the karma that leads to rebirth, because it's the nutriments are, not to go into the detail about it, but they maintain beings in samsara. So it's by feeding on them that they drive consciousness further into rebirth. So I guess what comes to mind for me is like when you perform an action, if it's a wholesome action, the Buddha is kind of saying, even if you're doing something good, if we're ignorant, which most of us probably are here, then when we do that, there's actually a subtle part of our mind that's actually kind of feeding on that in the sense of building up. It already is expecting a reward. Even if you don't believe in rebirth, you don't even believe in further existence after death. But still, when you do the action, the mind is kind of creating a result for itself. It's trying to inhabit that result. It's trying to, like Bhante was saying, the sense of self. And it feeds, the Buddha calls it a kind of nutriment that the mind feeds on. So that comes to mind for me, that the Arhat, their mind is completely wholesome, but their mind is not feeding on those actions. It's not expecting any kind of result. And so it can't propel itself further into rebirth. That's kind of something that came to mind.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, because all unawakened beings, we're constantly nourishing our sense of self. We're constantly nourishing our self-identity, our belief in self-existence. Whereas an arhat has completely eliminated that. So the rest of us, every time we perform any action, that action is reifying our belief in self-existence. Whereas an arhat has no belief in self-existence, therefore their actions are just expressions of the purity of their mind. But it's not reifying that sense of self-existence, because it doesn't exist anymore for them. So then we have a question from Miguel. Miguel says, Bhante Sudaso, some time ago you mentioned that you had witnessed somebody who had attained arhatship. That was probably a different person named Bhante Sudaso, because I have never said that. Yeah, so I can't answer this question, because as far as I can recall, I never have said that. In fact, I usually am quite circumspect about any questions related to this topic, and I don't think I ever have even said that I've met a stream enterer. I've probably said it's possible that I may have at some point met someone with some stage of awakening, but I am quite certain I've never once said I met an arhat. So I have said I've met some very remarkable monks who had very advanced wisdom, very advanced purity of conduct and behavior, but that I wasn't sure whether they were awakened or not, because it's really hard to tell these things from the outside. But I have met some really amazing monks. I just can't say for sure whether or not they're awakened. I can just say they're really amazing monks. And Bhavani says, is the mind storehouse of all the information, or karmas of previous rebirths? Bhanda?
Well, it also will depend on who you ask. So there is a concept of a storehouse consciousness or a warehouse consciousness that exists in some Buddhist traditions. But I'll just speak from my understanding of the Buddha's teachings in his early discourses. And I would say that the image of a storehouse to me is a little bit simplistic of the mind. Like sometimes we think nowadays our mind is like a computer, and memory is kind of like we're writing things, but that's really not how memory works. It's not, we're not, our brain is not recording things somewhere in the neurons. Memory is creative, it's created actively. So, and that's also true not just of the brain, but when we have an experience, it's always being created in the present. So memories don't exist as some kind of particles that are physical or anything like that, kind of floating in the mind or whatever that might mean. But I would say that do our actions have an imprint on our mind, and does that affect it across many lives, and can it be recalled and everything like that? Yes. So in terms of the mechanism of it being stored, I mean, I think that image might be a little bit too simplistic. But I think that definitely the Buddha is pointing to the fact that our mind is like sensitive, so it will pick up and it will kind of take on the color and the shape and the characteristic of the intentions and the actions that we're feeding it. Also just the experiences that we have in general make an imprint on it. So maybe something is very strong and has a really powerful impact on your mind. It'll be a very vivid memory. Or if you do something very bad or very good, it'll be very powerful, affect your mind very strongly. But I wouldn't call that a storehouse personally, at least. It's not how I would phrase it.
Okay. And Chema says, in what planes of existence can samadhi/insight be practiced in addition to the human realm? Well, theoretically, all of them, but realistically, it's considered easiest or most ideal in the human realm, and then possible but progressively less easy as one moves up the rankings of the various heaven realms. So in theory, the heaven realms that are the closest to human existence would be the next easiest place to practice samadhi and vipassana. The animal realm, while theoretically possible, it's just incredibly difficult for animals. Their minds are too driven by instinct and impulse. So it's very difficult for them to train their minds. Not impossible, just extremely difficult. And in the suttas, we have many records of devas from the lower heaven realms who practice Buddhist mind training with some degree of success, including some who attain lower stages of awakening. But there are no records of animals attaining any stage of awakening. Bad news for all cat lovers out there. Your cat is not actually enlightened, in fact, far from it. So yeah, theoretically in any realm you can train the mind, but realistically the human realm is ideal and next best is the low heavens. And the farther up you go the heaven realms, the more difficult it is. And when you go below the human realm, it becomes nearly impossible.
Is there any reason why it's harder in the higher heaven realms? Is it just too pleasurable and that there's no incentive to practice at all?
That's the main problem. So it's the main spur for practicing Buddhism is the experience of dukkha. And the problem is that the devas have so little daily dukkha that it's really hard to care. There's a really cute sutta with Sakka. So Sakka was king of well, still is actually, he's still alive theoretically. King of Tavatimsa, is that right? Yeah, Tavatimsa. And he was in fact a follower of the Buddha and even attained stream entry as a deva. And there's a really cute sutta where he comes to the Buddha and gets a teaching from the Buddha, and then he goes back to his heaven realm. And Mahamoggallana goes to visit him and is like, so what did the Buddha teach you just now? And the Sakka's like, oh, I forgot, but check out this orchestra. It's got the best music, and come check out my mansion. It's so cool, and I've got all these awesome friends. And Moggallana's like, what is this guy doing? So it's kind of like he heard the teaching of the Buddha, but then he gets back home to his Deva realm, and it's just like nonstop parties with the best music and the best people. And like, why would you care about Buddhism? Because you've got thousands of years. Like there's no rush. And so it's more that tendency to just kind of be in party mode all the time. And then you just don't really care about practicing anything. And there's also that sense that you have an infinite amount of time. One of the biggest problems in the Deva realms is that their lives are so long that they easily fall into the delusion of timelessness. You can see this actually in young humans. It's like humans who are in their teens or 20s, they have that sense of, I'm going to live forever, so what's the rush? I'm just going to go to a party this weekend, and maybe I'll get around to like practicing seriously in my 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s. Oops, dead. So that's what it's like for the devas. With humans, though, we have aging and sickness to wake us up a bit. So maybe you waste your 20s, but then in your 30s, you start to realize your body's not feeling quite as good as it used to, or your 40s or your 50s. At some point, it starts to sink in, oh, I actually don't have all the time in the world, and life kind of sucks, and maybe I should start training my mind. Devas don't experience aging and sickness until right before they pass away. So they also don't have those little daily reminders that we get. How old are you?
21.
Okay, when you get into your 30s, you'll start to understand what I'm talking about. Pay attention to the decline in your health, and keep in mind it only gets worse. It actually starts at the age of 25. 25 is your peak of physical health. After 25, it's all downhill. Yeah. Doom is coming. Yes, go ahead.
You said a deva won't experience any sickness until they pass away. What is a deva?
So devas are like angels or demigods. semi-divine beings who live much more pleasant lives than humans do. The lower devas are very similar to humans. They're kind of like the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Norse gods. They're like that. They're quite human-like. They just live much longer, more pleasant lives. And they're not subject to sickness and death. They're not subject to sickness and aging the way we are, but they still eventually die. It's just thousands of years down the road instead of a few decades. Okay. Okay, and next question. Valerie says, what are the authority structures and the roles of family members in this culture? What is the nature of male and female relationships within this culture?
Well, I assume you're asking about Buddhist culture, not American culture or whatever culture you're in. I mean, I'll just answer this briefly because honestly, it's better to look at some kind of anthropology study if you're interested in Buddhism, Buddhist cultures. But in terms of the Buddhist teachings, he really more was emphasizing, he wasn't so interested in like family structures and the details of that. What he was more interested in was in respecting your parents. So in terms of one of the views that was around at the time was that there is no mother and father. So what exactly that means is debated, but the idea that it's important that your mother and father, it's because of them, they're one of the conditions, one of the most important conditions for having a human rebirth. And also then they raised you, at least your mother did, for at least before you were born. So the idea is that there's a karmic connection there between the parents and the child, and also the parents are a condition for the life of the child, and so your own life of practice. And so the Buddha said that it's good to encourage your parents in the principles that would get them a human life. So it's because of your parents that you got a human life. So how do you get, that's one condition, you have to have parents. What's the other condition for human life? It's the sufficient amount of good karma, so good deeds. And that basically the Buddha defines as the 5 precepts. So not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying, and not taking intoxicants. And so he said, if you teach your parents to follow those principles, they will have a human life. So it's kind of like you're giving birth to them in retrospect in the human world. If you don't do that, he said, even if you were to carry them around in your shoulders for your whole life while they were making a mess all over your body, still, it wouldn't be repaying their debt because that doesn't get them a human birth. That just gets them basically nice treatment for their life, and then they die, and where do they go? So yeah, the Buddha, he emphasized that. And then he also emphasized if you can establish them in the higher teachings. Obviously, we don't want to preach to them, but he's more saying in the ideal scenario, that would be what a child would do. And then the parents are also supposed to take care of the children in terms of it's bad karma to mistreat someone, especially someone who's dependent on you, or a small child, or someone who is vulnerable, right? So parents also have the choice of most cases, parents might choose to have a child. Obviously, there are exceptions in all these cases, but so they have a responsibility. Also, just in the fact that they chose it, they need to follow through with that. And then in terms of male and female relationships, it doesn't really matter. The Buddha didn't really talk about gender in that way. He more just talked about having, if you do have a partner, to treat them with respect, to respect the boundaries of consent. But he didn't really talk about male, female. There are a couple places where people maybe asked him about marriage and things like that, but it's not really a primary teaching in Buddhism.
Okay. And Rebecca asks, are there any books or writings by monastics that you can recommend on dependent origination? I often recommend the first book, which for me really kind of opened it up and helped me to understand it a bit better, which was by Ajahn Buddhadasa, called Practical Dependent Origination. That was actually quite helpful for me. Is there any you can recommend? Is there anything that you found helpful?
Well, there's one that actually a monk I know just wrote. It's called Seeds, Paintings, and a Beam of Light. And it's on similes and for dependent origination. Yeah, maybe I'll write the monk's name is Sunyo. Yeah, Seeds, Paintings, and a Beam of Light.
Interesting.
Yeah, he's a good monk.
And S asks, what's the difference between samadhi and samadhi? Samadha? I think you mean samatha, S-A-M-A-T-H-A. So samatha just means peacefulness. So it's from the root sam, which means peace, and the suffix ta, which means ness. So samatha literally means peacefulness. So it's talking about anything which cultivates peacefulness of mind, or the peacefulness of mind which results from doing such practices. Whereas samadhi refers to a state of mind in which the mind is unified, stable, alert, steady. So samadhi literally means collectedness or unification. So when the mind is collected and unified, not distracted, not scattered, not spacey. So it's very alert, very still, very settled, very awake. So it's important to understand that samadhi, as defined in Buddhist practice, is a state of alertness and clarity coupled with stillness. So if there's stillness without alertness and clarity, that's not right samadhi, correct samadhi. That's maybe a trance state or state of blurriness or spaciness or sleepiness, but that would not be samadhi. And we have a question here. S says, what is the Pali meaning of the word meditation? Is it the same as concentration? Asking because the meaning sounds weird after translated into our language. Do you want to speak about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the Pali meaning of the word meditation, maybe you mean the word bhavana. Bhavana is usually like there's dana, sila, bhavana. So it's the three types of ways of making merit, and bhavana is often translated as meditation. So that might be what you mean. But when you say the Pali meaning of the word meditation isn't Pali, so it doesn't have a Pali meaning, and neither does concentration. But if I had to guess, that's what I would guess you're saying. And then by concentration, I guess you mean samadhi. So is bhavana the same as samadhi? That's my best guess. Maybe you want to specify, but I would say generally speaking that they don't mean the same thing, but they're related. Bhavana is kind of a short form of chitta bhavana, so cultivation or development of the mind. Bhavana literally means like bringing into being or making something more, like making it grow. So chitta bhavana is making the mind develop, making it grow, bringing higher states of mind into being. So the primary way that that's defined in the Buddhist training is samadhi. So adhicitta, higher mind, chitta bhavana, development of the mind. Basically, it means samadhi, but it also means other things. Like it means, for example, developing loving kindness. And that doesn't necessarily mean at the level of deep samadhi, but just developing your mind to be more kind, to be more loving, developing your mind to be more peaceful, like Bhante was talking with the samatha. So bhavana in that sense, it's a little bit broader. It just kind of means any practice that purifies and develops your mind in a wholesome way. Whereas samadhi is really a specific kind of state of mind that can be developed, but it's not, you might not necessarily be in samadhi if you're developing thoughts of kindness, for example.
Okay. And Lewis says, the sutra quote, inclining the mind towards the deathless. Does this imply a fierce state of resolve or persistence to become awakened, like having your head on fire, or is there some other meaning? So when I hear inclining the mind towards the deathless, I don't necessarily think of a fierce resolve. Rather, I think more of like, what do you incline towards? What is the inclination of the mind? So that means more like, what is the mind generally more likely to go towards? So it's more about priorities. It's more about tendencies instead of that kind of fierce resolve. So a fierce resolve, of course, will incline the mind in that direction. But inclining the mind in towards awakening, it's more like establishing awakening as your goal and pointing yourself in that direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be going full speed ahead. It's more just that's the general orientation or general direction of your mind. And Valerie asks, how are the elderly perceived in Buddhism? What are the attitudes towards marriage, partnership, and family life? It's a little similar to the earlier question.
Yeah, I feel like we kind of covered that. I mean, just in terms of the elderly, the Buddha did also talk about respecting elders, but it's really not a blind respect, like, oh, just because they're older than me. It's good to respect people who are older than you. It's good to respect everybody. Younger than you, older than you, same age. But especially respecting people who are elderly in terms of their wisdom. So like most old people, even if they're foolish, they'll have some wisdom that you don't have, even in a mundane sense. So respecting people who can offer you that guidance and who are at least an example of something not to do, maybe, for example. So I think, yeah, he talked about respecting people ahead of you, and that would include people who are ahead of you in age in terms of their wisdom or their qualities that you can learn from, but not just blindly because they're older for some reason other than being kind.
And maybe, Valerie, maybe if you could clarify what you mean when you ask how are the elderly perceived. As for the second thing about marriage, partnership, and family life, well, the Buddha never anywhere actually encouraged or recommended getting married or having a romantic partner or starting a family or anything like that. The Buddha actually never recommended it or encouraged it anywhere. What we do see is the Buddha saying, if you are in a relationship, whether that's a marriage or a non-married romantic relationship, if you are in a relationship, then as Vada was saying earlier, treat your partner with respect, with kindness, with appreciation. Do acts of kindness for them. Do what you can to, sincerely make their life easier. Don't take advantage of them. Don't abuse them. But be kind and respectful and supportive to them. But it's definitely not encouraged to get married or have a partner. But if you do wind up in that situation, then you want to be sure that you're not creating bad karma, but instead that you're treating your partner with kindness and respect. And Robert says, what would be the best way to cultivate a sense of safety? And what could be a skillful definition of safety that one could cultivate? Well, first off, there is no safety anywhere. It doesn't exist. There is no safety. The only safety is full awakening. Everything else is just various degrees of danger. So your only chance of genuine safety is actually to attain full awakening. You can get some temporary mundane safety through cultivating good karma, because that will produce good luck and increase your chances of having positive, pleasant conditions, both in this life and future lives. So if you want a mundane sense of safety, then just do lots of good karma and constantly remind yourself of all the good karma that you're doing. That will give you a mundane safety because you know that you're creating the conditions for good fortune. But true safety is only attained in full awakening. There is no other true safety. Okay. And S asks, could you please briefly explain how vipaka works? Is it similar to how karma works?
Well, when you go to the gym and you exercise and then your muscles grow, how does that work? So when you do good deeds and then it changes your mind and then your mind continues on and it puts you in different conditions through samsara, how does that work? Well, it's just the natural evolution. It's the way that the mind works. Just like if you exercise your muscles and your muscles will change, when you exercise your intentional actions, those intentional actions shape your mind. And then your mind shapes your experience of the world.
Yeah. And Aparna asks, which sutta gives a good overview of the 16 klesas? 16 klesas, that's not a list that I immediately recognize. No. 16 klesas, that might be an apocryphal list. If it is from the suttas, it's probably something which only appears in a very small number of places because it's not something that I recognize. Briefly speaking, if you want a good overview of the klesas and how to overcome them, I recommend reading the Sutta Pitaka, cover to cover a couple of times. And I recommend that to everyone who's sincerely interested in Buddhism anyway. But realistically, you'll find it's so full of really useful information that there's really no point in singling out one sutta, because literally every sutta has something useful to say to you. And and Rick asks, can you talk about how conceit relates to conceiving, as in Majjhima Nikaya 1? It depends on the words you're using for conceit and conceiving. The most common words that are translated that way are mana is translated as conceit, and manyati is translated as conceiving. And as you might recognize, they're actually from the same root. So the word conceit, the word mana in Pali, we translate it in English commonly as conceit, but it actually means concept. So mana is the concept of self-existence, the concept of me. And the word manyati is conceiving. It has the sense of creating a concept, an abstract idea of something. So rather than seeing things as they actually are, instead we create a mental concept and take the mental concept as reality. So it's actually exactly the same process. We create a sense of self and we take that mental concept as reality, even though it's not real. It has nothing to do with reality. Similarly, whenever we're relating to any experience, based on that experience, we create abstract ideas in our mind about what we think the experience is. And that's what we inhabit. We inhabit that mental abstraction rather than the actual lived reality. Instead, we're living in our mental version of reality. So that's what manyati, it's what conceiving is talking about. It's about how we create concepts, mental abstractions, and live in our little mental version of the world rather than in the world itself. Okay, good. And Samir says, the Vimalakirti Sutra goes, the Dharma is not a secure refuge. He who enjoys a secure refuge is not interested in the Dharma, but is interested in a secure refuge. Could you disambiguate this verse? I would probably have to see the context, to be honest. I have a feeling that there's probably a context for that statement, which would give some better clarity for it. It would probably also help tremendously to see the Sanskrit original, because the way things are translated often ambiguates them. I found this especially true, by the way, of the Mahayana Sutras. Most of the translations of Mahayana Sutras are terrible, like abysmally bad. I actually had a really shocking experience when I started getting deep into the Diamond Sutra, and I read the Diamond Sutra in Sanskrit. And I realized that there have been nothing but bad translations in English. And those bad translations in English are mostly based on the bad translations in Chinese. And you actually read the Sanskrit text of the Diamond Sutra, which is actually pretty old, much older than the Chinese versions that we have available. And it makes so much more sense. It actually is relatively clear in Sanskrit. The Chinese translation completely muddled it, and the English translations are even worse. So the translations of the Pali Suttas these days are actually getting pretty good, but the English translations of the Mahayana Sutras are still mostly unreadable, various levels of unreadable. Okay.
Yeah, that's all I was going to say is that for that verse, what comes to mind for me is the simile of the raft.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, as Bhante said, we don't know what it means. But in terms of the Buddha talked about not clinging to the Dhamma, not clinging to the teachings, because that's not what this is about. It's about escaping rebirth, not having ideas or not having doctrines or views that are more sophisticated than other people.
I mean, ultimately, the secure refuge is full awakening. The Dharma is the vehicle for getting to full awakening. As you mentioned, the simile of the raft. Dharma is the raft which brings us to safety. But the raft itself is not safety. It's full awakening that is safety. Yeah, I mean, that sounds reasonable. That's probably what it's talking about. S says, I did some research, and according to some stories about Ajahn Chah, it was said that it's very likely that he has achieved Arhant. Yeah, lots of people believe Ajahn Chah was an Arhant. I don't know for sure, but I can totally understand why lots of people believe he was an Arhant. He was clearly a really, really, really good monk. Okay, and Stevie says, recently I laid bricks for a monk's garden. Sad. They kept bringing buckets of decomposing food and burying it. Great, good for them. That's a great use for decomposing food. Stevie says, I was repulsed by the smell and the large bugs. Thoughts on mindfulness in this situation? What do you got to say?
Just be mindful. Don't think about it. That's my thoughts on that. I mean, you just have to, if you're repulsed, then just observe that in terms of looking at, okay, what is really going on here? Why am I repulsed by this decomposing food if it's what I just ate 2 hours ago? And now it's different. Now they're throwing it in this garden, but I just threw it in my stomach and mashed it all in there and chewed it up. So it's kind of just reflect on that and just look at the bugs. Also the bugs, seriously, what is it, people? I don't understand. Like bugs are just, we look extremely strange. We have these limbs and look, these fingers branching out, and humans constantly are making sweat and odor and hair is growing and skin is shedding.
And
I mean,
noses are so weird.
Yeah. Also ears.
Actually, I imagine we look really disgusting to bugs. Probably insects look up at us and they're like, what are those hideous monsters?
Yeah. Like, have you seen a caterpillar, a butterfly? Worms are also very interesting creatures. So, I mean, if you're repulsed by bugs, just think about, oh, that could have been my mom last life. Because also the Buddha says, this is a reflection that's very common in Buddhism, is the Buddha says it's really hard to find a being that hasn't been your mother, hasn't been your father, hasn't been your brother, hasn't been your sister, etc., in past lives. And so you just look at the bug and it's like, we could be related. In fact, we almost certainly are. And so kind of reflecting, and then, but really just looking, basically bring mindfulness to the situation. Okay, I'm repulsed. You don't try to remove the repulsion in terms of, I mean, you try to remove it, but you don't try to deny the fact that you're repulsed. So you have to understand it. And then through understanding it, through seeing it, and through seeing the kind of ignorance and the bias that's in the mind that's creating it, then you let go of it. So you do try to let go of it, but look at it and be patient and try to understand. You have to have the idea first that there's a problem, second that there's a cause of the problem, and that there's a way that can end. So you have to understand this repulsion is not justified, for example. And then you just apply the mindfulness, you apply the medicine.
Good. Okay. And then Alysa says, above you on the wall on either side are scrolls with writing. What is written there? See, that one is, they're both quotes from the Dalai Lama. I'm not going to read them out because they're both a little on the long side. Yeah, they're just like cute Dharma quotes from the Dalai Lama. Yeah. Okay, and Samir says, the Aganya Sutta seems to present a Buddhist creation myth. Does Buddhism even need a creation story cosmology if Shakyamuni was only interested in how suffering could be ended, not how it began? Well, there's many different opinions about what the Aganya Sutta is doing. I mostly take it as a metaphorical representation of the evolution of consciousness, how the mind can gradually become increasingly coarse and obsessed with coarse sensuality. How the mind can start off as something which is relatively refined and subtle. But as we become increasingly involved with coarse sensuality, then the mind also becomes increasingly coarse. And then our quality of life then starts to plummet. So that's more my understanding of the Aganya Sutta, is that it's more meant to be taken as psychological metaphor rather than as strict literal. So most of the Pali Suttas, I think, actually are strictly literal. The Aganya Sutta is one of the few which I do take as being more metaphorical. Yeah, do you have thoughts on the Aganya Sutta?
I mean, I think that's a good thought. I guess what I would just say, creation myth, I don't really agree. I don't really think the Aganya Sutta is a creation myth. It's actually saying when the world ends, then it restarts like this.
Hmm.
So it's really about the ending of the world and then how it recycles. So, I mean, at least on the surface level of the sutta, right? So I would say, I wouldn't think of it as a creation myth. I'd say that would be reading, it'd be a little bit too, we have that tendency, maybe if we grew up in a culture that has like influenced by Christianity and Judaism, for example, the theory of the Big Bang, that was just thought up by people who got tired of Christianity. So they tried to replace it with God. So the beginning of the universe with this Big Bang theory, right? Of course, it's based on observation, and it's not that it's wrong, but the idea that that's the beginning also has problems. So Buddhism is saying, well, the Big Bang is maybe that's the beginning of this world system, but what about before that, right? So the idea that there is kind of a finite point in the beginning isn't really part of Buddhism. The Buddha says, anamata gayang bhikkhave sangsaro. So this samsara, this round of rebirths, has no known beginning. Pupa koti na panyayati avijani varanang satanang tanha sangyojananang. So no first point is discerned of beings shrouded by ignorance and shackled by craving. Sandhavatang samsaratang, roaming and wandering on. So basically the idea in Buddhism is that because of how suffering works, so the Buddha wasn't just interested in the ending of suffering, second noble truth. He was interested in the creation of suffering, like how it began. But what he found is that, well, because of suffering arises due to ignorance, and it created this current experience, this current rebirth was created through ignorance and craving. But then you see, okay, wait a minute, but right now there's ignorance and craving that is the conditions for more rebirth in samsara. So when you trace this back, basically it's kind of like this loop that doesn't actually have a beginning point because it was created by craving, but craving has created the next one. So I wouldn't take the Aganya Sutta as a creation method, but I think definitely it has many, many layers. I would include, I don't think it needs to be taken literally either.
Okay. And Don says, if hearing the Dhamma is such a rare thing in samsara, why does it seem that monks often advise practitioners to take care of worldly responsibilities instead of practicing all the time or ordaining? Well, first off, you should ask the monks who say those things. You should ask them why they say those things. Second, I would recommend you ask yourself why you think that taking care of worldly responsibilities is something other than Dhamma practice. So here at the monastery, somebody has to take the trash out. Somebody has to sweep the floors. Somebody has to wash the dishes. That's all taking care of worldly responsibilities. And yet it has to be done. And doing that with mindfulness, with equanimity, with compassion, from a spirit of generosity, that's all cultivating wholesome mind states. So it's not like, okay, now I have to stop doing Dhamma practice while I wash the dishes. Now I have to stop doing Dhamma practice while I sweep the floor. That's not how it works. Rather, you make your responsibilities another opportunity to train the mind in the Dhamma. So you make everything you do part of your Dhamma practice. So if you have worldly responsibilities to take care of, then make it part of your Dhamma practice. Train your mind in the Dhamma while you do those things. If you think that there is actually a monk you know who's saying things which actually are contrary to Dhamma, then ask them about it. And see what they say. It might be that actually it's something that you don't understand, and maybe they'll explain to you in a way that you can understand. Or maybe it's possible that the monk actually is saying something wrong, and you pointing it out to them will help them. Probably not. Usually it's the other way around. But it's always worth asking because there's a chance that you'll learn something. And S says, what is the difference between Alya Vijnana and Amala Vijnana? According to my reading, when Alya got cleared and pured, it becomes Amala, which is at a deeper and higher level. Is it true? I'm not sure I've ever heard Amala Vijnana before. Amala probably means stainless or pure. So mala means a stain or a flaw. So amala means unstained, unflawed, flawless. So Amala Vijnana, a mind without any flaws or stains, that would actually mean the mind of someone who's fully awakened. So the only people who are ever called Amala or Vimala, stainless, are people who are fully awakened. Those are the only people who have completely unstained minds. And Amit says, what do we do if our practice regresses? I feel as if my concentration goes back and forth and regresses. What do you think?
Well, it's normal to have plateaus. It's normal to do that's part of the process of learning. So it's good to investigate. Why is it like? Is there anything particular that's making it regress? So when you say regress, going back and forth, like it would depend on the time period. So it's hard to do it without a personal conversation. But like, what do you mean by regressing? And then, so I'd look into that. Right? Is it like, one day to the next, or 1 week to the next, or it's been over years, you've noticed a gradual decline? Because that makes a big difference. So it's very normal for like every day things will be different. It'll change. The state of your mind is going to be changing. But if you notice a regression over years or longer periods, like months or things like that, probably you're doing something different. If it's a regression, not just a plateau. So you really just want to look into, okay, what is going on? What does my ethical conduct look like? So how is my mind just in my daily life? Am I doing anything unmoral, breaking the precepts? What does my more refined level of kindness look like? So on the level of my subtle speech and on my inner speech and on my inner thoughts, am I being unkind to myself and others? So do I feel that sense of blameless happiness? Also, how is your engagement with the senses going? So that the Buddha calls that abhyaseka sukha. So the sukha, that the happiness that comes from being unblemished, also maybe untouched by the kind of bombardment of sense activity with the desire and aversion. So looking at that, and then looking, how content are you with your life? Are you kind of very ambitious, trying to get more, trying to build things up? Or are you building a sense of contentment and ease and just relaxing and kind of taking it easy? So looking at kind of those conditions, because those are the conditions that the Buddha gives for developing the mind before you even get to purifying it from the hindrances. And then you start looking at the hindrances. So what hindrances are present? What ones are recurring for you, and why? So if you're sleepy, there's probably a certain reason, and that's a whole other topic. But so kind of looking into that, and then and investigating. But if it's just a little bit back and forth, or it's a plateau, that's actually really normal, and it will just keep putting in the conditions, and don't really so much think about like, oh, today it's like that, yesterday it was like that, but now it's like this. Just do the practice and just develop these qualities as if it was a new session every single time, because that's really, it's going to be a huge obstacle if you try to constantly compare with the past.
Okay, good. And Wise Man Say So says, working in healthcare, I see a lot of elderly patients who are faced with their own mortality. Any strategies on how to help them cope better with this stage of life and these thoughts? Well, one of the problems which comes up is when if somebody has lived a non-spiritual life, then when they get close to the end of life, then sometimes it starts to sink into them. It starts to really settle into them. Actually, the futility of life. And without the solace of spirituality to carry them through, then those last few decades of life can be extremely upsetting. So watching your vitality decline, watching your health decline, watching your mental conditioning become increasingly flawed, watching your memory fade, your capacity for rational thought fade, watching all your sources of pleasure become increasingly inaccessible or unsatisfying, that's quite challenging. Even for people with a spiritual practice, it's challenging. But for somebody without spiritual practice, it's really overwhelming. So honestly, the best way you can help elderly people face their mortality is to teach spiritual practice to young people. So that then when they get old, they'll be able to face mortality well. The biggest problem is that there's so little genuine spiritual practice these days. That's why there's so many people having such a hard time with old age, because they didn't practice when they were young. And now when old age comes, what are they faced with? They're faced with an empty heart, an untrained mind. Of course, that's painful and difficult. So what can you do at this point? Offer them comfort, offer them solace, encourage them to reflect on the good things they've done in their life. If they do have any kind of religious beliefs or values or spiritual anything, then really get them to focus on that. Bring that to the forefront of their minds. If they don't have anything like that, then there's actually not a whole lot you can do except just to comfort them and be there for them and make them feel cared for. And yeah, get them to remember the good things they've done in their life. But yeah, the real problem here again is approaching old age without a foundation of spiritual practice. That's the real problem. And when it gets to that point, I mean, there's only so much you can do. Okay, and Rick says, can you speak about how to skillfully cope with the 8 worldly winds while taking care of our basic needs, the 4 requisites?
Okay, the 8 worldly winds. Praise, I'm just going to try to remember them here a little bit. Praise, gain, honor, blame, pleasure, pain, and fame and disrepute. Is that how they, or is that the same?
Yeah, good reputation, bad reputation. So let's see, gain, loss, pleasure, pain.
Part of it is the...
Oh god, this is the problem with lists.
Yeah, the thing is the translation also. I should know the Pali. I don't actually,
yeah.
I don't think I know all the Pali.
Gain, loss, pleasure, pain. Good reputation, bad reputation. Oh, there's one more pair.
Well, there's one that's really similar to the reputation and the fame, like popularity, or it's like similar kind of, I think.
Yeah, you should memorize the Pali. It's easier that way.
Okay. Well, anyway, we have the general idea. I guess, okay, so while you're taking care of your, I guess I'm not too sure what you mean. Maybe do you mean in your job? I don't know. Maybe we could ask for clarification, Rick, a little bit, because I actually am not too sure how to answer the question, Nespante. Maybe you have something to say, but I don't have a clear understanding of how these two relate right now for you as a layperson.
Yeah, I actually don't see it either. So I don't really see a connection between the two, except maybe in the gain and loss thing.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Maybe, yeah, in terms of having the access to the things.
But even then, like if you don't have access, then you practice equanimity. That's really your only option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe if you could clarify, Rick, in case. Yeah.
And Sud asks, what would be a good goal for a layperson who is busy to achieve spiritually in this life? Should one also make an aspiration to become a monk in his next life? Well, in this life, practice kindness, practice generosity, practice equanimity. When you have time, do some meditation, do some sutta study, do some chanting. And yeah, make the aspiration that in your next life, you want to have ideal conditions for practicing Dhamma. You don't necessarily need to specifically wish to become a monk in your next life, but rather wish to have ideal Dhamma practicing conditions, which then means monkhood is a sincere possibility, because in theory, this is for having the ideal conditions.
Is it possible to become awakened as a layperson?
Theoretically, but it's so extremely rare that I wouldn't put your hopes on it. Yeah. S says, what is the difference between Dharma and Sutra and Sutta? Panda?
Okay, well, Sutra and Sutta are the same thing, but one is in Sanskrit. So Sutra with the R is in Sanskrit. Sutta with the 2 T's is in Pali. Kind of like similar with Italian or many different languages where the consonants will be simplified. So Sutta and Sutra mean the same thing. And they just mean basically a discourse or a text or it's a Buddhist scripture is what it boils down to. So it's it's one unit of Buddhist scripture, you could say, one document, one text. It could be very long, could be very short. And then Dharma has many meanings. But basically, in this context, I would say it means the teachings of the Buddha in general, which correspond to the way things are in reality. So Dharma is like the law of the truth, or the law of reality, or the way of things. And at the same time, it also means the teachings of the Buddha, because the Buddha is supposed to be teaching the way that things are. It's supposed to be teaching the nature of things. So Dharma means the teachings of the Buddha, but also the way things are. And the sutras and the suttas are the texts, the scriptures that at least claim to be documenting the Buddha's teachings on that.
Okay. And Stephen says, in some suttas, the Buddha advises monks to develop a mind that is mudu. Can you recommend some practices to cultivate this quality? So the word mudu means soft or pliable. And so it has the sense of, a mind which is relaxed and at ease, a mind which is, it's the opposite of brittle. So when the mind is brittle, then that means it's rigid, it's inflexible. It's easily broken because it's fragile. So whereas a mind which is mudu, it's soft, it's pliable, it's flexible. So this is a mind which is relaxed and can easily adjust and adapt to shifting conditions. So actually the main thing I'd recommend for cultivating mudu is relax. Especially during your meditation practice, just relax. Don't take it too seriously. Let your face relax and become soft and easy. Let your posture relax a little bit. Take a few deep breaths. Just enjoy doing nothing for a little while and notice how the mind feels. Notice how the mind starts to get this soft, spacious feel to it. And then when you start focusing more intently on your meditation practice, you can keep that sense of softness and spaciousness. And you'll find that actually allows you to get much deeper and more stable concentration. So it's very different from like if you try to forcefully clench your mind down on your meditation object. Well, that actually feels quite uncomfortable and rigid and fragile. You can only keep that up for a little while before it starts falling apart. Whereas a relaxed, gentle kind of concentration tends to be much more sustainable and also much more enjoyable. Okay. And Thinnery says, how does one work with lust towards a person who observes sila, and what are the dangers? Well, it depends. If you are not currently keeping a vow of celibacy, then this answer is going to be very different if you are currently keeping a vow of celibacy. So that makes a tremendous difference. For those who are keeping a vow of celibacy, then it's just not an option to do anything about those feelings. So then you just pay attention to the painfulness of those desires. You pay attention to how it makes the mind uncomfortable, agitated, unsettled. You also recognize that it's futile to even let the mind dwell on those thoughts, because not only is it creating discomfort for you in the present moment, it's also about something that just isn't an option. And come back to whatever practices that you normally do to stabilize your mind. Things like mindfulness of the body, for example. You can also reflect that even if you get what you want, it won't be satisfying. It never is. On the other hand, if you're not celibate, then that's a whole other story. Then the practice is about approaching relationships with an attitude of kindness and respect. And that's a whole different scenario. Okay. And Eric, this is a question for me. Eric says, a few weeks ago, you mentioned that you did not recommend practitioners read the Vasi Maga. That is correct, I did say that. Could you elaborate on why? I always had the perception that it was the Theravada version of the Lamrim. Well, if by Theravada version of the Lamrim, you mean a document written over 1,000 years after the Buddha by some random monk about his personal opinions, then in that sense, yes, it is similar to the Lamrim, and that the Lamrim also was written over 1,000 years after the Buddha and expresses some monk's opinions. So in that sense, there is some similarity. So the Vasi Maga is fine as long as you understand it for what it is. It's a book written 1,000 years after the Buddha by some random monk expressing that monk's personal opinions. Like, it's really no different than like Bhante Bob writes a book like Bhante Bob's Opinions about Meditation. It just wouldn't be anywhere near as popular. So the Vasi Maga has a certain popularity, primarily actually because of political conditions at the time and place it was produced. So it's interesting to understand the political context for the production of the Vasi Maga and its relationship to the government and the country at the time. then you start to get a sense as to why that book rose to prominence. It has less to do with its content and more to do with regional politics of the time. But the book itself, when you actually analyze its contents and compare it to what's in the suttas, you'll find it's rife with contradictions. It's full of material which is not in accordance with what the Buddha was saying. So what is it? It's a collection of the opinions of some monk 1,000 years after the Buddha. That's all. The main reason for reading the Visuddhimagga is actually to understand how much of the last 1,500 years of Buddhist history has been influenced by that book. That's the main reason for reading it. But the book itself is not a good guide to the Dhamma. It's just a good guide to understanding how the opinions of this one random guy 1,000 years after the Buddha had a big influence on the development of the Buddhist world. Any thoughts on the Visuddhimagga?
I think we can leave it at that.
Okay. I realize as the years have gone by, I've become actually increasingly intolerant to the Visuddhimagga. I used to be a little bit nicer when I talked about it.
I mean, I guess all I would say about the Visuddhimagga is I would say it's good for understanding the Theravadan. If you want to understand the interpretation, like Bhante said, in terms of what is the Theravadan, the official Theravadan, you could say doctrine. It's the same as reading, like, for example, the Abhidharma Kosha. So in Tibet, or maybe not in Tibet nowadays, but Tibetan monks study, for example, the Abhidharma Kosha. In China, they also study other Abhidharma treatises. So the Visuddhimagga is the equivalent of the Abhidharma treatises of the Theravadan school. Almost all the major branches of the ancient Buddhist schools all had some kind of form of that. So if you want to understand the Theravadan one, then you can see that. But that doesn't mean it's important to understand that it is an Abhidharma treatise. So it uses Abhidharma, Theravadan Abhidharma to analyze its content. So it's not necessarily also meant to be like Intro to Buddhism 101. It's really meant for Theravadan teachers to use the Abhidharma system in their tradition to analyze the Dhamma.
Okay. And Wasabi-chan says, does metta mean having to like everyone? Can I still have metta towards a person I dislike? Well, it depends what you mean by like and dislike. So metta at its core is just the simple wish, may everyone be happy. So it's the attitude of benevolence, unrestricted, unconditional benevolence. It's just wanting everyone to be happy. That's all. So it doesn't actually matter what your personal preferences are. You might be like, well, I like people with dark hair. Well, okay. That doesn't mean that you then want everyone with light hair to suffer. Or, well, I like people who are into golf. Well, okay, that doesn't mean that people who don't play golf, you want them to suffer. You still want everyone to be happy. So you might have personal preferences about people, but that doesn't mean that you want some people to be happy and others to be miserable. You still want everyone to be happy. So you don't necessarily need to like everyone in order to want them to be happy. And Aparna says, if meditating on one object, say breath, and an unwholesome thought arises, do you observe / ignore and wait for it to pass, or do you actively respond, try to replace with wholesome thought? Well, the Buddha gave several different options. The classic sutta for this is the Vitakka Santana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 20, in which the Buddha gives 5 tactics for dealing with exactly this scenario. So one of them is, in fact, replace with wholesome thought. Another one is, in fact, to ignore it and wait for it to go away. That is, both of those are among the strategies the Buddha gives. So realistically, what you do is you try one tactic, and if it doesn't work, then you try another one. And eventually you wind up at the 5th option on the list. And if even that doesn't work, well, at that point, just give up, relax, take a few deep breaths, stop meditating for a few minutes. And by stop meditating, I mean just sit there and do nothing. Just literally just sit there. Just let your body slump a little bit. Take a few deep breaths. Just stop doing your meditation altogether, but just don't do anything else either. Like, don't think about stuff. Don't fantasize or daydream or space out. Just literally do nothing for a few minutes. Stay awake, but do nothing at all. And after doing that for a few minutes, then you might resume your meditation practice with a fresher mind. And Mariah says, how do you practice mindfulness of the body? When I try to fix my attention on a spot of the body, it always goes to the breath instead. How am I supposed to just watch the body? Well, mindfulness of breathing is part of mindfulness of the body because breath sensations are body sensations. So if you're doing mindfulness of breathing, then that's fine. That's still mindfulness of the body. But when I practice mindfulness of the body, usually what I'm doing is feeling the whole body as a single object, as a whole zone of sensation, which includes in it the breath sensations, but is not limited to the breath sensations. And Samir says, does the Buddhist teaching of anatman, in the Pali tradition we normally say anatta, relate to collective as well as individual selves? For example, I am not just Samir, I am supposedly a US citizen, male, Indian, and human. You're actually not any of those things. You're not anything at all. There is a current experience happening. From one perspective, you can say there's a current experience happening, but that experience is not who you are. It's just a temporary experience, like a dream. So you might have a dream, and in the dream, your name is Bob, and you're an Italian citizen, and you're female, and you're a cat. So that would be a temporary experience. And while it's happening, you might even really believe that's exactly what you are. But then you wake up and now you're having a different dream, a dream in which your name is Samir, you're a male US citizen who's Indian and human. Well, that's just another temporary experience which you're misperceiving as reality. It doesn't mean it's who you are, it's just a temporary experience that's currently being viewed. Here we go. Hasanta gives the 8. Gain, loss, status, disgrace. Yeah, good reputation, bad reputation. Praise and blame. Yeah, that's what we were conflating.
Yeah.
Good reputation, bad reputation, and praise and criticism.
Yeah, because they're kind of related.
Yeah, they are related, but they are somewhat different. Yeah. Okay, so Rick says, I was wondering how to not get caught up in the 8 conditions while we are trying to maintain our basic needs. Yeah, that's just exactly the same question you said before. So it's still not clear what the relationship between these two lists are. Yeah, I don't get the relationship. Maybe if you can explain why you're seeing a connection between these two. Sud says, I have noticed that my metta is strongest in the morning after listening to Paritta chants, Dhamma talks, etc. Right? But as day goes by, my patience runs thin to the point where I can clearly see, although my responses are not overtly terrible, they are stemming from a bit of irritation within the mind. How does one develop patience to let go of things when tired? Banta?
Okay. Well, I would say when you're having that positive experience, this is what comes to mind for me. When you're having the positive experience with the metta, it's really good to remind yourself of the pleasure of that. So like the wholesomeness, the blamelessness, the joy, the peace, the ease, how you're making progress in your spiritual practice, you're creating merit for yourself right here, right now, for the future, and also for other people. So really kind of reflecting a lot on those benefits, not just like, oh, my metta practice is great in the morning, but it sucks in the evening and I'm horrible. It's like, no, you should really be saying, oh, my metta practice is great in the morning, but oh, it's great in the morning, but it's great in the morning. So you really reflect on that thought again and again, again and again. So we want to consolidate that, because the fact that you even have amazing metta practice after listening to Paritta chanting is more than most people they don't have amazing metta practice at all. And then the fact that you have, as the day goes forth, a bit of irritation within the mind, that's also great, right? Compared to a lot of irritation. So it's really good to reflect on those qualities, because not only does it build confidence, but it also will discourage the mind from going towards the irritation, because it starts to see, oh, this feels really good. It makes me feel like I'm making progress. It makes me feel like I'm a good person, it brings me lots of joy, other people, all the benefits of metta, which you can also observe. And then your mind will be less inclined. And also it'll be less inclined to get kind of tired and irritated because it has the joy in the mind. But at the same time, when you are tired and irritation, a big part of that is having metta or kindness towards that experience itself. So like, in a sense, you could say acceptance, but not acceptance in terms of tolerating unwholesome qualities, but instead saying like, okay, my mind is tired, it's a little bit irritated. That's okay, mind. May you be happy, may you be well, may you be loving. It's okay that you're not full of metta right now. I accept that. And it's actually paradoxical because what you're doing is the tiredness and irritation that's arising is going to be coming through past conditions. But now you're putting in new conditions of metta. But you're not trying to remove the past conditions. You're just putting in the good conditions of kindness, of acceptance towards your mind, of awareness, and kind of this gentle intention. And that is the intention that is behind the metta. So you do it very subtly, and you kind of, you trick the mind into letting go of that gradually. But even if it doesn't let go, that's okay, because you're still putting in the conditions for the future. And then you just keep up your practice and try to do your best and remind yourself that you're making an effort.
Sadhu. Okay, and Rick says, I notice the loss of peace when my basic needs are threatened or not met. Yeah, so as I was mentioning earlier, in those situations, your only fallback is equanimity. So when we get our needs met, then we practice contentment with having our needs met. And when our needs are not met, then we practice equanimity. And we practice patience, we practice endurance, we practice tolerance. Because this is the reality of things. So I remember a number of times on Tudong, so when doing wandering practice, so walking for many kilometers a day, 15, 20 kilometers a day, sleeping in the forest at night. So you're cold, you're tired, you're exhausted, and you go for alms round the next day, and you don't know what you're going to get. Sometimes you don't get as much food as you want, or you do get food, but it's only bread and nothing else. And don't get me wrong, I like bread, but when all you eat is a big bowl full of bread, and when you're exhausted and cold and tired, and it's like, well, I'm grateful I have something. Can I be content with just this much? Is it really meeting my needs? Well, that doesn't matter, because I'm practicing contentment, and contentment is nourishing in and of itself. So ultimately, we nourish the mind with contentment, with equanimity. And that's what gets us through those difficult times where we really feel like our basic needs are not being met. And Jim says, Vadda, I wonder if you would briefly speak on how your monastic life has been so far.
Good. Said briefly. It's been
maybe another minute or two.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a great grounds for my aspiration in life in terms of my spiritual practice, and also great grounds for growing in lots of ways that we don't grow. We wouldn't normally grow in terms of community life, in terms of observing my habits or my mind, in terms of, I guess, just growing in the sense of not just following the Noble Eightfold Path, but all of the, like not just following, you could say, the basic principles that the Buddha laid down, but also kind of really getting into the nitty gritty of things. I feel like a lot of that comes up with monastic life. At least it's been my kind of experience so far, in terms of you are really concentrated on purifying all of your conduct, and the whole lifestyle is based around that. And also your spiritual companions are doing that, and they're also supporting one another. So I guess for me, the big kind of thing that's come through with my monastic life has been definitely supportive of my aspiration, but also kind of really digging into investigating a lot of my types of my relationships and my conduct on a more refined level, especially in terms of community life or in terms of just being around other people. constantly, like living in a monastery and also on tudong and traveling around. We're constantly around people, constantly dependent on people, and navigating that situation. It has been a lot of room for growth, a lot of kind of fertile ground for investigating that.
Great.
Yeah.
And Andrew says, how to stop reincarnation once and for all. I can't keep doing this over and over and over again. Actually, you can keep doing it over and over and over because you have been for literally ever. So you can keep doing it literally forever, and it will continue to suck literally forever. But if you want to stop, then you practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you want it to stop sooner rather than later, then start living in monasteries. That helps tremendously. And that's the last question. So if there's no other questions for now.
I kind of wanted to ask earlier. There was someone who mentioned that if they were, their reality is that they are like a U.S. citizen, and you mentioned that's kind of like a dream. What would be reality then in that sense? If me being like a U.S. citizen and a woman is a dream, what would be the reality?
Well, the reality is that we're not anything specific, but rather under certain conditions, we will appear to be having a particular experience. So this experience is temporary. So you haven't always been, for example, a female US citizen. That's just the current experience that's happening. It might feel like it's been that way forever because you have this memory of having been a female US citizen for a few years now. But you haven't always been like that. It's just what's happening right now. So it's a list of conditions, all of which are subject to change. So in past lives, we've been every different gender. We've been every different species. We've been every different imaginable nationality or state of being. And so right now we're having this particular experience, but that's not who we are in any kind of ultimate or absolute sense. It's just the experience that's currently happening. Okay. Yeah. And a couple more questions have appeared online. Sud asks, is there a way to combine mindfulness of the 32 parts of the body with metta practice? Not really. They're kind of two distinctly different things. What you can do is have a kind and gentle attitude while practicing mindfulness of the body. But they're not really compatible because they're different practices. Stephen asks, Bhante, do you have advice on how to admonish others? Are there suttas about this that you're aware of you can recommend? Yes, the one that comes immediately to mind is called the Chodana Sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5. I think it's Sutta number 167, if I'm not misremembering. Somebody just asked me about it the other day. Yeah, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, I think it's Sutta 167. It's called Chodana Sutta. And it's exactly this. It's advice on how to admonish others. Yep. I've given talks on it in the past. It's a really good sutta. Rick says, okay, just reflecting on earlier. And Amaranta says, how does Buddhism explain what happens to a child when he dies? It's the same thing that happens to anybody else when they die. Whether you die when you're young or old or somewhere in between, it's always exactly the same. You fare on according to your karma. And remembering that your karma also includes what you've done in past lives. So even if somebody dies 1 second after being born, they still have all the karma from past lives that has yet to express its result. So that will be what will determine where they go from here. Okay, so it looks like that's it for now. So we can go ahead and conclude the monk chat. So monk chat featuring monk cat. We can conclude the monk chat with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.